name is Josh, and I'm the chair. Welcome to the sixth round of World's 2016. I'm going to go around the room and ask people to provide their preferred gender pronoun. I'll start. My name is Josh, and I prefer he.
My name is Sonia, I prefer she.
I'm Kaiser, I prefer she or they.
My name is Nikhil, I prefer he or they.
OG.
My name is Andrea, I prefer she.
Drogo, she. AJ, he.
Lindsay and he. Andrew, he, speaking second.
Isabel, I prefer pronouns.
Linus, he or they.
Catherine, gender neutral, she.
Great. Thank you, everyone. With that in mind, I now invite the Prime Minister to open today's debate.
We are proud to propose for this Parliament to oppose a sunset clause in order to legally enforce governments to review and re-authorize or to revise their constitution every generation. Now, first of all, I would like to clarify what we believe that the role of a constitution in a society is, and to outline its importance, and to prove to you that a constitution, generally speaking, is the architecture and defines the architecture of each society. And then, second of all, I will try to prove to you that we live in constant changing societies and that we can identify a need of every society and every country to self-actualize itself and to readapt to the new context that we are currently finding ourselves in. And then finally, I would like to explain to you why we cannot do that if we do not have this possibility and we do not impose this obligation from the governments to do this by imposing a sunset clause. Now, to begin with, what is a constitution? A constitution represents the fundamental law in a society. No, thank you. It defines the basic values of a society, and it basically describes the way that society will be governed and the fundamental rights and liberties of the individual. It represents a tool through which every citizen is protected against the political, possible potential political abuse of politicians or other agents, and no other law could actually disrespect the Constitution, and if it does, that law would be abridged. Now, how do we believe that this mechanism should be imposed? We believe that a generation represents every 25 years, let's say, because in 25 years, a child becomes psychologically an adult and basically adds something new in our society. And what do we believe by imposing this obligation to review, reauthorize? Well, looking at the wording of the motion, we can see that if a need in order to intervene is identified, that the Constitution will be actually reviewed. But if there will be no need, then no necessary change or modification of the Constitution will be imposed. So we do not have the obligation to artificially intervene and to modify the text of the Constitution if there is no such need. Another question we want to answer is, how do you identify this need, how this mechanism would work? How we see it is as following. So it will happen every 25 years, and politicians, so the parliament and the judicial court, would have the obligation to make consultations with the civil societies who have attributions and who have relevant activity, and further on, a referendum should be made after exposing to public debate the idea that the Constitution will be modified. Now, moving on to the need, to actual need, why do we say that we should do that every 25 years? So the Constitution would actually represent us and would define our needs. Well, we have seen that modern society, access to information and access to technology and the possibility to travel from one place to another and to see how other people live and how other countries govern their own country have made us as peoples more capable of identifying the fact that maybe we live in a too conservative society, or that the country where we belong from did not progress enough, and the law which we have been taught that these are our fundamental values start to be questioned. And unfortunately, such change could not be produced without intervening in such a drastic way. Now, when we talk about change of values, let me give you some examples in order to make the discussion more palpable, more concrete. Not now, thank you. we are talking about societies which are more conservative, where marriage is defined by a constitution as the contract between a man and a woman, which might be and might not represent the values of the majority, or even if the majority of the population does not agree, there might be minorities who do have the right to be respected. We are talking about issues, controversial issues which are defined by constitution, like the right to live and the consequence of interdicting euthanasia, and the freedom of choosing what you do with your own body, the freedom of the freedom of maybe taking light drugs, or I don't know, practicing prostitution. It is not us the ones who define what are the needs of society, but we believe that it's very important to engage in a concrete and constant dialogue with the society in order to identify what their opinion is on these issues. And then further on, let me give you some more examples. What another factor which is modified by a changing society and by the context we are living in is, for example, the social stratification. Maybe in constitution, you do not have the right of every minority to be represented in the parliament. And maybe those minorities actually became more aware of the fact that their right to be represented in a parliament should be respected, and that they have the right to do that. And the constitution, which is the fundamental law which governs them, should protect them in that way. Okay, and even more, we could talk about more complex things like the form of government. Maybe a state should not be a republic, should transform itself into a monarchy, or maybe a federal state should become a nation, and so only one nation. Yes, please.
Constitutions often have more than 100 articles, like 100 separate laws on separate issues. Are you literally going to put them to vote all together in a referendum? Are people going to vote on each law specifically?
No, thank you. Well, as I said, the result of these modifications should, so we will not oblige somebody to make these modifications, only if a need will be identified. And then second of all, we believe that the population has knowledge about what the fundamental rights of that state are, because this represents common knowledge, and this is somehow instinctive. We believe that the Constitution describes a form of instinctive law, and so basic natural law. And now further on, why this sort of adaptation to the changing societies could not happen now? Well, because as we see, constitutions are currently modified according to political will. There must be the initiative of a parliament who would propose changing the constitution, and then they would put it to referendum. But referendums are not actually relevant nowadays, because people do not feel the power, do not feel that they have the ability to actually intervene in society and to modify the way a society is constructed. They have this feeling of not being possible to actually influence the way society is constructed, reason for which they have no interest in documenting themselves and participating to a real change. We believe that through this measure, we would determine society to change its position and to eventually start participating in the progress of society. Out of these reasons, we beg you to propose.
Thank you very much. I now invite the leader of the opposition.
Honorable panel, this side of the House wants to live in the world where we are governed by a system that is best not only for this generation, nor even the next generation, but rather the system that is the best possible conception of governance that our minds can conceive. To this end, we believe that the Constitution ought be written with the intention of permanence, that it be held to the highest possible standard, that in the long run, changes to the Constitution may happen, but the changes that are implemented should be made with the intention that they will be held true for all possible future generations, and therefore held to the highest bar, placed with the highest burden, and held to the highest standards. Why is this? Because the structure of the democracy is a prerequisite to democratic action, and therefore, should not be held hostage to that democratic action itself. We will tell you in this speech two things. First of all, why we believe it is that this system will never work, never functionally come to any reasonable change. And secondly, we will tell you that even if it were to function in some way, you will have worse outcomes for the members of the society at the end of the day. However, before I get into these points, I have to request that opening government please clarify what they mean by the process of referendum. We don't really understand whether or not the referendum is on whether or not to open up the Constitution to amendment change, or whether the referendum will be on each possible change that could be implemented, as the POI by our backup suggested. We appreciate clarification on this. We're going to run with the idea that this referendum will be on whether or not to uphold the original Constitution, and also on each subsequent amendment that might be proposed. That being said, the practical harms to this situation. So this won't work for a number of reasons. Why is this? So first of all, every time that this comes up to a new vote, the people who are in power at that time have every incentive to re-entrench their own power with this opportunity. We tell you that that means, first of all, that either one, it will entrench the political power of the ruling party, which will mean that future generations are going to be held hostage to the political manipulations of their ancestors, or it means that there will be such gridlock because the political opposition to the political party in power at the time that there will never be any reasonable change to begin with. We believe that this gridlock point in and of itself is something that can damn the government bench for this round. Every time that this comes up, the incentive for each party will be to entrench their own power, and there will never be a situation in which the two parties can work together meaningfully to create change for the future generations that will be positive to all parties concerned. We would tell you, in addition to this, that if there is gridlock so bad as this, then there is the potential that the referendum date will pass without the Constitution having been ratified, and the government will then go into a state in which the Constitution does not exist. We would ask the government to tell us what exactly happens in this case.
So sunset clause represents that if you do not take action upon Constitution, you don't revise it, you don't discuss about it, then it's not valid anymore. But if you discuss about it, so the simple fact that you're debating about it makes it valid again and prolongs its
Well, so you tell us that we need to have a referendum to reauthorize this Constitution. I'm telling you that there will be such bad gridlock because of the incentives at play here that the referendum will not go on, it will not occur. They will not agree to either reestablish this Constitution or change it in some way. At that point, your sunset clause will expire, and your government no longer has a Constitution. What happens in this vacuum? I don't know. Maybe there's a military rule, maybe there's a government takeover. I don't know what happens here, but trust me, it's not good for the individuals on the ground in that case. Now, gridlock, yeah, okay. The other reason why this isn't going to work is because in the interim period between generational changes, we don't believe that there will be the incentive to go forth with amendments then. People will wait, rather, until the appropriate period at which it will be opened. This will happen after this has been internalized by the population, after this new system has been codified into law for the existing population on in a given state. We say that once this has been codified, people will wait to a particular date to introduce changes, which means that in the interim period, people will not be able to introduce the changes that they want. We tell you that for these reasons, this new system will never have any practical functioning for the individual members of this state. Now, the second area that I want to talk about here is why, if this works in some magical way, that the political parties don't gridlock the system trying to re-entrench their own powers, we are going to get worse outcomes for the individuals on the ground in terms of what's going on in this Constitution. So first of all, we believe that the Constitution is not the place where we should be codifying the laws of the land. Rather, the Constitution should codify the procedural mechanisms whereby those laws will be created. However, under their system, where change is so regular, so accepted, and so where change happens so often and so regularly, this is going to be used as a way of putting laws into place that then won't be changed until the next generation. This is going to be very bad. Why is this? Because first of all, it's going to be used as an opportunity to codify certain social norms that exist at any given time. This is highly problematic, given that any one given generation's conceptions of social norms are occasionally, we have found throughout history, perhaps not the most equitable options for everybody involved. For example, we would say that if their system existed for the last 20 years, we would have seen DOMA, the Defense Against Marriage Act that existed in the United States, codified into law in the Constitution in the 90s. That would have been extremely bad for gay members of the American community, because their right to marriage would have been constitutionally precluded from them for the next generation's worth of people. Additionally, you could see all kinds of social norms, including religious preclusions, etc., being codified into a constitution based on the interpretation of the individuals in that generation at the time. Now, Another way that this is going to go really badly is through lobbying and political pressure. I think that this is going to be a fundamental point in this round, because if this process is going to be opened up every 25 years or so, then that means that all of the different interests in the state at the time have 25 years to gather the appropriate political momentum to get their laws passed, to put the money in the right places, to put the right people in the right places, etc. We say that this means that your constitution will now include provisions that will allow for certain parties to have certain parties, for example, firms, for example, labor, to have their political interest manifested in the Constitution at the time of the amendment process. I can tell you that this is absolutely not the appropriate role for a Constitution, as I mentioned in my overview at the top of this case. The next thing that I want to talk about here is the difference between, is the unjustness of a generation, of one generation establishing what the next generation will do. The generation who is in power at the time of the amendment is going to be codifying what will happen for the next generation. We tell you that this generation does not have a conception of what the next generation wants, and for them to be able to prescribe in the constitutional way what happens to that next generation is unjust, because to amend that process for the next generation as they grow up, that will be far more difficult than the process of, for example, overturning a law that generation would have passed in the other case on our side of the house. We tell you that for these reasons, you are fundamentally going to have a less just system, a less functional system, and a worse society on their side of the house. We urge you to vote opposition.
Hear, hear. Thank you. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, honorable panel. We believe that population is generally progressive. We believe that population doesn't generally want to harm different agents of the society when it's not the case. We believe that population is empathetic most of the time, but that only happens when it's aware of the problems, of the situation, of the things that are implied by certain actions, by certain legislature. So we believe that the most population of the country is not aware of the problems that many constitutions create, like as the ones enumerated by my colleague, like value of life, like the concept of marriage, like social stratification, like the way in which a country should be guaranteed, and is not aware the problems that all these concepts create for different individuals, and therefore they don't care enough to change it. They don't care enough to get involved actively in doing something against it. In my speech, I'll have 4 major points of rebuttal, and afterwards I will tell you about how this will change how political class works, and will create more awareness leading to change. Okay, so first thing first, no thank you, gridlock. We believe that in many situations, many agents in a political scene want to impose their own power. We see this constantly happening in many levels, like on the budget of the US, like in international trades partnership as TTIP, and we see every single time that it ends up with a certain result, with which most of the time, most of the people are happy of. Why? Because at the end of the day, all these kind of things have so much stake in it, so much stake in resolving it, with so many bad consequences when you do not resolve it, that you as a political party, you don't want to portray yourself as the loser, as the one who stopped progress, as the one who put himself against the progress, or against like solving a certain problem. So we always have like your end goal is getting somewhere in the middle. Second of all, why don't we believe that there will be an opportunity for specific social norms that are problematic. We believe that the majority of population is not xenophobic at the end of the day. When we look at extreme, like at how population votes and how population in most of the countries relate with extremism parties that could provoke like this kind of extreme changes that could be harmful, we see that they don't actually vote them. We see that there is no actual direct vote in no country to more than 5% or 10% by the population, even in the current context in which there are huge cultural clashes, there are huge cultural problems regarding extremism, which might create this. Even more, we see that Front National in one of the most prone to problems countries has even lost the elections, most of them, while proposing this kind of change. No, thank you later. Moreover, we believe, third point of rebuttal, that today's generation we have no problem with today's generation settling the context for the next generation. We believe that if the next generation will be harmed enough, will have the chances to repair this and to re-actualize it as it needs for the individual. But we don't see any major problems appearing from this context because there will be no agent to propose this, as I've told you in my previous rebuttal point, no extreme point of view. Yes, please, first.
So you tell us that if there is significantly low number of people who are these extremists, then this gridlock can't happen. However, if there are 10% of the population that are extremists, they could gridlock this system if your referendum is held to a 90% vote. How big of a majority do you need for your referendum to be passed?
Okay, to make this clear of what this referendum is, my colleague clearly explained it, that it's in the context of actually talking to people and asking them, what's your opinion on these measures that we are proposing? Like, what's your opinion? We've identified these problems. What's your opinion on it? Should we change it? Should we not change it? And at the end of the day, to have a clear portrayal of how population sees it and to be able to have another point of view besides the civil society, besides the NGOs, to be able to ask directly also the population directly. Okay, so moving on to my point, to my constructive point. We believe that, as my colleague said, the society constantly gets self-actualization because of many factors: information technology exposure that leads to the perception of how do we value different rights and what rights do we want more. We want to destroy the current concept of family and make it more diverse. Why is this important, and why is this not happening in the current society? Because there is no political will. Why does this happen? Two major reasons. Because first of all, population is not aware, and when politicians represent a majority who is not aware of these needs, the population will not ask for it, therefore the politician will not focus on it. And therefore, at the end of the day, this is as a major point on a politician's election program or on his table of problems that has to be solved, has to solve. Moreover, we believe that the second problem for which there is no political will is that population has different needs. Maybe some individual has particular needs in like the change of the perception of marriage. Some other individual has the need of the change of perception of value of life. At the end of the day, there's no common coagulation of this desire, so there's no pressure on the politician to make these changes. Third of all, we believe there's no obligation of them, and because there's no awareness, we are never putting them in front of the population and make them pick a choice. Make it either yes or no. They always remain in the gray area, and we cannot sanction them for not taking a side or taking the side. So at the end of the day, we realize that we are creating a need. We are creating a population who is aware of these things and who can put pressure on these politicians to do something. Why is it important for the politicians to pick a side? First of all, if they will go for the revision, for the externalization, we already see the resolve of the needs. But second of all, if they go against, first of all, people can sanction politicians who do not represent them, and they can better identify with the best politician that can serve their needs. And moreover, there is a stake that we create for progression, and therefore more progressive ideas are there. And second of all, we raise discussion because you create a direct clash, and politicians cannot remain in this gray area. So what have I told you today? That the society self-actualizes itself and second of all, that there's no political will, and we can provide a change, a mechanism for change, and to encourage the population to care about all these things. Awareness, ladies and gentlemen.
So pretty good?
Thank you very much. I now invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Briefly, before I get into anything else on the model, we don't get an answer to the POI. I think in this round we have to at some point assume what the scale of this referendum would be, given that in most countries constitutional amendments require something resembling a 2/3 majority, that is, there is a higher bar than a simple majority in most of these places. We'll assume for the purposes of the round that this is what we're talking about. This isn't what we got under opening, but I think it's fairly reasonable at this point in time. We think then that the question is, what is this referendum for? Our understanding of the model at this point and how this op has been structured is that the model is suggesting that we have to reapprove the Constitution by this majority every N years, every 25 years in their case. We think if it fails, there's an automatic referendum. This is our understanding of what we are engaging with in this round. I'm going to give you a little bit of extension on what constitutions ought be in our conception and why we think their conception of a constitution is particularly deleterious to the conception of how states ought to operate, and then a little bit of rebuttal and a little bit of redevelopment of some of the material coming out of our case. First, on what a constitution ought to be. We think the role of a constitution is to form a government. It is not to legislate. We think when constitutions are made to be constantly malleable documents, that what they become is a tool for the passage of legislation. Why is this problematic? Because we think the intent of a constitution, at its very most basic, is to define government. And in defining government, it's to constrain government. It's to say that laws may be passed by democratic majority. We think laws probably ought to be passed only by a simple majority. But that there are basic things that laws cannot pass. That even if it is the case, that the majority of the population feels that we should oppress the minority, that the Constitution ought to exist to provide a direct check on that kind of behavior. We think the problem with making constitutions malleable, as they are suggesting on their side of the House, is that the Constitution no longer serves as a check on itself. Why is this so problematic? Because the avenue that we're getting out of opening government for the social change that they so badly want and we don't think they're accessing is through the Constitution. That is to say that when they think that they want marriage equality, they think the role for that, the way that we ought to create these things is through the Constitution. That is to say that their goal in this round is to use the Constitution as a vehicle for social change. We think rather that laws ought to be the role for social change, that laws ought to represent democratic institutions, that laws ought to change very frequently, ought to be representative, ought to have sunset clauses perhaps, but that constitutions themselves exist before laws, that constitutions exist to shape democracies rather than to legislate, rather than to pursue democratic ends, and that when they make constitutions malleable, they prevent the very check that we think is the reason constitutions are so valuable. They no longer have any meaningful way to determine what is and isn't legitimate action for the state, because the way they are passing the legislation is through the vehicle for its checking in and of itself. Sure.
The reality is that constitutions actually are the ones who protect the most important instrument, which protects and defines our rights, and at the same time it can restrict our rights through the way it defines them. So this is why we might need changes.
So we think overwhelmingly that constitutions that include provisions that are explicitly discriminatory are probably bad. We think in those circumstances it's appropriate to amend those constitutions. We think on our side of the House that it is probably fine to have provisions in those constitutions for constitutional conventions. Why is it preferable on our side of the House? Because we think there ought to be a very high bar in order to open up the Constitution. Because the Constitution itself is the document that checks every other kind of law. We think constitutions generally ought to be written to explicitly protect the negative rights of citizens. That is, the things that governments cannot intrude upon. That when constitutions start ascribing positive limitations, that constitutions start saying marriage is X, that is not the role of the Constitution. And we think that when they make that the role of the Constitution, even if they believe it is in a positive way, they lead to disastrous effects. Why? Because of the tyranny of the majority. Let's talk about what happens given that they're saying every 25 years. This is not just when the populace has gotten together, has raised massive political will, has decided something is wrong and needs to be changed. Rather, it's every 25 years. Why is this problematic? Let's look at the United States. 2001 could have been the end of a 25-year cycle. At the end of 2001, the United States saw something like 95% support for the invasion of Afghanistan and substantial curtailing of citizens' civil liberties. We think if the Constitution is malleable, and if the Constitution Constitution is going to be up for review in 2001 because it's any year at the end of the cycle that they have prescribed, that the populace at that point in time would be comfortable with substantial curtailing of civil liberties. We think the nature of the Constitution is to protect against this kind of tyranny of the majority, and that when you have things like this, there are more contemporary examples as well, like France's anti-immigration laws that are now being brought to the table since the end of this month, which we think is so problematic and would be codified into permanent law without any meaningful check against them if the public was in favor of it. Given that something like 80% of the French public is in favor of these laws at this point in time, we think it is likely that this would happen and it would be disastrously curtailing for civil liberties. Maybe it would only last 25 years, but we think 25 years of vicious civil liberties violations is a horrific thing and one they have to defend in this round. Go for it.
What do you think about the modification of the second article in the American Constitution, which recommends the access to weapons?
I think that might be a good idea, but it's something that can be pursued through other avenues. I think if the possibility is maybe we keep some bad things that are negative rights, that are explicit protections against government action, we would prefer to have more protections against government action than to allow the government to intrude more actively into citizens' lives, because we think active government intrusion is far worse than the government allowing people to do too many things, which is the example that they're using. Like, yes, maybe the Second Amendment is imperfect, but we don't think that's good enough for them on their side of the house. Given the curtailing of civil liberties, that's very possible. This is also true of extremely xenophobic policies, of anti-immigration policies in much of the EU right now, of even economic policies. We think when you make the role of the Constitution what they want it to do, it no longer serves its fundamental purpose. It no longer defines government. Government no longer functions. Okay, little bit of independent rebuttal. First thing, the second argument they make broadly is they say things change, societies are conservative, but people are slowly moving towards the right ideas. We think if people are conservative, which is part of the argument that they're making here, that people are likely to enforce bad laws. I think this is especially true given that legislatures are disproportionately older than the general population, are disproportionately more conservative just on aggregate by virtue of being older. We think at the point that that's true, that they don't solve for this. We think the need in a constitution is fundamentally different from what they're describing. We think laws solve the ends they're attempting to reach. Third thing they talk about is why the status quo fails, why you need massive political will to change a constitution. We think this is a good thing because we think constitutions ought to exist to protect rights. We think a lower political will barrier should be held for laws, but we think that exists in the status quo, that they are not solving for that. Rather, they are creating a venue for legislation that is not checkable by any other means, that is internally contradictory. A little bit of reconstruction dealing with some of their rebuttal. Isabel talks about why there's an incentive for groups to retrench their power given this. A great example of this in the United States is what's called gerrymandering, where the districting process is controlled by individuals who are currently in office. Their incentive is to draw districts, to draw the people who vote for them, to support their continued election. Given that this is the case, a majority party in parliament, if they had a large enough ruling coalition, could very feasibly draw out district lines, could change electoral policies such as to retrench their own ideas. We think this is incredibly problematic. We think it's incredibly likely if you ever have a large enough governing coalition. Let's say you don't. If you don't have a large enough governing coalition, so there isn't that incentive on their side of the house, we think you run into the situation where nothing gets done, there is no active constitution, and even in their best case, they're not causing real change. We're proud of those.
Thank you very much. I now invite the government member.
Mr. Speaker, so far from the opposition, we've got a very negative approach to everything. They've been telling us why this won't work. Few things of rebuttal, first of all, before I move on to my main substantives. One of the main points coming out of the Leader of Opposition's speech was social gridlock. The idea that nothing will happen. We say that conflicts are not so simple and they're not so binary in the nature that have been portrayed by the opposition. First of all, if conflicts are so important to everyone, it is likely that to make these changes, they might, if there is a gridlock existing, they might adopt violent methods which are even worse than having a discussion or having a temporary problems. On the other hand, and this is something we want to avoid at all costs, this kind of fight which happens in countries like Thailand, which are at these crossroads, where there's such a big gridlock that to make change, people are adopting violent means, and this is something we want to avoid completely. On the other hand, there might be the idea of minor problems or minor disagreements. In this case, we feel that the disincentives of not having a constitution, or the suffering of problems of not having a constitution, or failing to readdress your constitution, are so great that all parties will get together. Not now, sir. Are so great that parties will work together, and all concerned parties will pass whatever is needed. This is similar to the idea of a US financial cliff, wherein parties work together and get it passed even across whatever party or Republican or Democratic lines there exist. They then say that, not now, sir. They then say in the interim period there is no incentive for parties to work. We say that it assumes that people are just going to wait. People will always make the changes which are being discussed by the public at that time. So the idea of no changing or just waiting for that particular review does not exist, because people will make the changes if they're necessary, not now, sir. Then they go on to talk about lobbying. We say that the idea of lobbying is more applicable in a closed environment which you are proposing. On the other hand, it's much harder to influence a whole population. What we say is it's better, not now, sir. What we say is it is better to have this opened up to everyone so that everyone can discuss it. And it is harder to lobby these individuals and to keep this retrenched kind of idea that they've talked about. They then talk about future changes, not now. We talk about future changes and how there might be a disconnect. We say that this disconnect will be greater in the case of no change happening. Of course, a person who has not been able to interact with the next generation will not know what they need, as compared to someone who is at least interacting with them. So these constitutions have been laid hundreds of years ago. Now, however, we're having this constitution which is able to adapt much better, maybe not perfectly to the needs of the next generation, but at least in a better manner. Lastly, they talk about the role of the constitution, not now, as the formation of government. We say, yes, this is a particular role of the constitution. However, it is not limited to this. The role of the constitution is also the protection of basic values that a particular country values, in the case of many countries it's being secular, or other such things. And they say that that's basically it. However, they say that constitution acts as a check and balance and everything in this nature. I presume I'm answering your POI. What I say is that they talk about the idea of the US in 2001, how this would be problematic. However, in the current system, things can happen in the same way. If there was a 95% sentiment against so much, they would make a constitutional amendment anyway. That would happen anyway. So what is better in your paradigm as compared to our paradigm? What we're saying is, in our paradigm, at least if some old thing exists, they're able to change it, they're able to bring it out for discussion. Now, however, I'll take your question.
Right, there's a limited amount of attention that people can put into, say, LGBT issues. If
Right.
at some point, like, LGBT issues don't get passed to the Constitution, people are simply
Right.
not going to care for another 25 years. I'm speaking about the majority of the population who
Right.
is going to vote in those referendums.
However, if it is a social issue and if it gains traction, if it becomes so important to be changed, everyone, the political parties in power, will address it because they have vested interest in passing these things to appease the people. However, if no one's interested in them, if everyone thinks they're acceptable as they are, there's no problem in it remaining the same. Also, in the nature of democracies and the nature of governments, we do not have government as sole actors. We have NGOs, other organizations, and they're more likely to put pressure on these minority issues, and these issues are more likely to come to the fore, and these changes are likely to be made. Now I'd like to move on to my main substantives. We say that in the current system of things, complete overhaul is basically next to impossible. Not only from a probability perspective, but from a legal perspective. Why from a probability perspective are we saying that complete overhaul is not possible? First of all, it's quite unlikely that people in power are going to do things which shoot them in the foot, which basically take away their own power, not now, please. And from a legal perspective, many basic values of the Constitution, whether they're right or wrong, are protected. You cannot do whatever they are. Even 2/3 majority is not enough. This is applicable to a wide variety of countries. And we think that there has to be some mechanism, not now, sir. We have to think that there has to be some mechanism to allow this change to happen. What we're also saying is that often what happens is if these changes do not occur, we have violent tensions. You have a country like Thailand, not now. We have a country like Thailand where because of these tensions, people are taking to arms, they're taking to the military to protect them, or they're having to have violent protests, violent uprisings against the government to get the changes they desire. However, if we have the system of every 25 years, every generation changing the Constitution or even accepting it as it is, this need to go towards a military or this need to adopt violent needs will be eliminated or diminished greatly. We then say, once a constitution is formed, it dictates everything. It does not reflect, it dictates everything, how the democracy is run, or even if do you need to be a democracy. Many countries may feel that it is better if they're not a democracy at that point of time. However, if the constitution exists, this is such a protected value that we will never be able to change it. However, in many countries we are seeing now that democracy may not be the best system of government.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
What is the benefit to ascribing all of the social policies you've described to a constitution rather than traditional laws?
The large benefit is that constitutions provide the core fundamentals. A lot of the issues we're talking about are core fundamental issues, be it the right to democracy, communism. All these issues are core fundamental values. And we feel that by changing the Constitution, you can address these core protected values. I'd really quickly like to go on to the benefits. First of all, if the Constitution is accepted by the people, they're more likely to follow it. They're more likely to abide by it and follow those core values which are defined by the Constitution. If they don't agree with it, however, they'll violate it at every opportunity they get, and the Constitution will basically become meaningless. In our context, at least the Constitution will value people, and people will value the Constitution as it exists. We then say that the Constitution being discussed, right now the discussion of the Constitution is limited to a select number of people who can be involved with it at that particular time. However, if you bring the Constitution and review it, everyone is forced to discuss it. At least it comes out in the public debate, be it the news, be it anywhere. And once people debate it, discuss it, we feel that there will be a better chance of getting that discussion and getting it out to the fore. Lastly, why on the generational level? On the generational level, we feel that a generational change represents a change of core values. A whole generation changing on means that those core values have changed. And because those core values have changed, we need to change the values that are outlined in the Constitution as being protected or being valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And now invite the opposition member.
Given that I've offered like 5 or 6 points of clarification and I haven't been like responded to one or like one only, I feel like the liberty to like make some assumptions about how this system is going to work. They're not central to our case, but they're very likely to come about. So what I'm going to assume is that if you don't get a quota of people coming to vote for that constitution when the referendum is, or if you don't get a majority, that like it will be simply considered that like no change will be made to the constitution will remain the same. This is essential because we will prove to you firstly that people will simply not be able to understand and be interested in all that type of information that exists in the constitution, and that's why it will get worse change, right? So we'll bring you firstly why Firstly, we will argue that even if you were to be able to make like meaningful change, people or like general population at a certain random point in time is not the best actor, is like the worst actor to make that decision, even if you get that quota. And secondly, we're simply going to be realistic and tell you that a law system based on such a constitution simply doesn't work. Not only for like the marriage system, but also for stuff like property law or economic system, right? So let's get through it. So like most rebuttals will be interwoven, right? So firstly, like opening government comes up and like makes a lot of assumptions, right? They make assumptions that people firstly are going to be interested in all 150 articles of the Constitution. Like, given the fact that we don't have like 3 referendums, one in which we decide what laws are we going to change, then one in which we decide whether we change those laws or not, we simply don't understand how those people are simply going to be like vastly interested in all those types of information, right? We're saying that the kind of interest and like the kind of sorts of information that are going to appear in the media and that people are going to be interested in will have vested interest, right? So if I'm a huge company, right, and I have the interest of purchasing land in the country next to me, right, and currently purchasing land in the country next to me is only able to can only be done by citizens of that country, right? I will heavily influence the media and the politicians in that country, right, to vouch for that issue, right? Which means that like it's really likely that that kind of issue will appear on the agenda. Why is this particular problematic, right? Because they bring up the example of TTIP, right? So TTIP has this really, really nasty clause of like settlements between companies and states, right? In which companies can come into your state and say, like, I don't like your constitution, and I really, really think that your constitution violates my ability to make profits, right? I will sue you for that constitution, right? I will ask you to change it, right? We're saying that at the point at which those groups have huge power to argue that that is in the benefit of the people, that free trade is good, that we're going to bring you cheaper products, right? It's really, really likely that those people will fall for it. We don't see, however, how those people essentially are going to make the right choice, right? So what are the reasons why people don't make the right choice, right? Firstly, we say that people have a limited amount of information, right? I simply might not understand economics. I simply might not understand like all sorts of law. I simply won't be able to understand the long-term implications of something that I vote for. Know that we're not only voting for marriage laws. No, we're not only considering extreme cases, which we think were fairly well explained by the first government. We're also considering stuff like property law, right? Stuff like whether I'm able to sell to a certain country or whether I'm able to like call an embargo on a certain country, stuff like that, right? Why is this particularly important, right? Because and this is moving on to like why you get bad laws, right? We're saying that firstly, like the ability of an investor to make profits is based on the assurance that the laws in which like their company functions are going to stay the same, right? So if I buy land in a country and invest in that business might only give me profits in certain like 50 years, right? I'm not going to do that at the point in which I know that in 25 years, somebody might vote in that country that I have to leave that country, right? This leaves countries which are like extremely poor, extremely in need of certain resources. It leaves them out of the question, right? Because as an investor, I'm not going to go into one of those countries. I'm simply want to go into one of the countries in which you don't have these kind of laws. Opening.
Look, in all the cases you've presented, population has no interest and will not intrinsically support it because it sees no benefits more than it sees a harm to its own nation. So no party would support something, but with whatever lobby you are sustaining, that will not give them another chance in the next elections because the population will not support it.
I mean, you're almost making politicians irrelevant in this discussion because they won't have any power to actually change the laws. They will have to abide by what the population says. They will only be able to make laws in that system of laws that the population has created, right? So I don't see how you like hold them accountable for that, right? So like, why is this particularly important, right? Because we say that like, firstly, because people have like a limited amount of information, a limited amount of time, right? They're going to be interested in the issues that affect them the most, right? They're going to be interested in whether they can purchase land in a certain area of the country. They're going to be interested in what definition of citizenship of that country is. They're not necessarily going to be interested in all issues, right? So if I'm a person who simply doesn't care about LGBT rights, I simply will vote indifferently to that issue, right? We're saying that a huge majority of people simply won't have the time to discuss these issues and to vote for them meaningfully. The problem is they're locking it for 25 years, right? So if I'm 17-year-old LGBT teen, right, I will have to live 25 years, right, without the ability to make a change, right? Because this is not just the fact that, 2 years later you can change the constitution, right? Because people will tell you, guys, we voted for it 2 years ago. We can't change it every 2 years, right? So essentially what you're doing is you're locking all those rights, of which people won't actually vote for them, right? You're locking them for those people, right? And lastly, what we're saying, even if all these things were to happen, what we're saying is that you're impeding on the judicial system, you're impeding on the actual functional laws being made, right? Because at the point in which the constitution is changed, right, like the parliament has to review each law and see if it works with the constitution, right? Note that laws take months and months to discuss, and laws take months and months to review, right? So basically, you're and companies can sue you if you change the laws that the country operates with, right? Note that you're going to spend tons of time as a parliament, as a government, reviewing laws that were perfectly fine, that people are fooled into voting into, right? Note that this is going to take a lot of time and a lot of resources that could have been spent advocating for real change. So what we get at the end of the day, we get that people are not the right actor to make this change. Secondly, we get that even if people were to be the right actor to make this change, they're easily influenceable, they're not going to vote on the issues they're going to make. Thirdly, this harms the economic and perspectives of the country. And fourthly, we're saying that it screws up the law system. Let's be realistic, guys. This is not going to work. Let's oppose.
Mr. Speaker, member of this House, society does change. The value of society also does change. In the instances which they do change, it's only appropriate, therefore, for the law to catch up with the societal value. What this policy does is that it creates the efficiency to allow the system to catch up. Or otherwise, in the context which a really stubborn government is in place, the stubborn governments would most probably disallow the public to change the law because the context of the government is stubborn and it's conservative at the very first place. They say this kind of system allow party or the bad government to entrench their power, to be hostile. It open up the gap for bad government to insert policy that benefits, right? We say no, review and re-authorize the constitution. But just that these two parties need to obey the constitution, voting system, or whatever, right? No, thank you. No, thank you. In their world, when the government is hard to challenge, when the bad government got up and set up a really unfair policy, it's hard to change because the government will do whatever it takes for it to remain in power, right? But in our world, if the government is not good or not well liked by the thank you, sit down. Not well liked, it's not well liked or not welcomed by the people. The people have the legitimacy after a certain period of time to go against the government, right? Because right now this kind of policy is in place for people to go against the government in a certain period of time. So it gives the public a legitimacy or extra reason to force the government to change its policy. Because you are free, because right now the policy are forced to be extracted and debated about after a certain period of time.
Okay.
So, no, thank you. So in the long run, we believe that this is one of the best checking systems against a stubborn, conservative, or in some cases, a really bad government, right? Second responses to this thing is that when it changes the incentive of the leader or of the parliament to set law, right? When the parliament, when the leader got up, this system will force the leader to set a more fair and inclusive law rather than law their unfair ethnically entrenched power. Why? Because in a democratic setting, government work on a populist basis, right? So in a democratic setting, government work on a populist basis. It works on the basis of votes. So in the context which you got up in the government and set up an unfair law, it's going to be struck down, and it will be struck down eventually after the law is being enacted by the public. After the law is being enacted in the public. So when the law when the particular law or constitution keep getting struck down again and again after year of review, after a lot of years of review, it's going to create a bad reputation of the particular leaders or government, right? Because what we see is that a government, the particular leader ultimately create laws that is unsustainable, non-inclusive, and getting struck down very quickly. So we believe that this changes the incentive for the leader to set law, whereby forcing the leaders to set a law that's more inclusive, more fair, and more just. So then, no, thank you. Conception of constitution, right? They say constitutions, based on their opinion, are things that forms the government and act as a check and balance. But ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not about what you think constitution actually is. This debate is about what constitution in reality and at this moment actually is. Right now, we have seen in a lot of cases, like for example, Malaysia, right? Constitutions define marriage as X, right? Define that this thing, the constitution are things that say if you're a king, when you actually got into a fraud, you are not free to be punished, right? So denying constitutions in the status quo will only make situation worse because you cannot change, you cannot at all change current bad thing or unfair law that's happening at the moment. Point. So, yeah.
You tell us throughout that there are bad policies being implemented. Would you rather these policies be implemented through a constitution where they cannot be changed for 25 years, or through a bill that can be struck down by constitutional provisions or overturned at any time?
Thank you, sir. Under the status quo, the constitution in a lot of countries are defined, are the things that define marriage as X. And we believe that these things are supposed to be changed rather than the things that form the government, as you mentioned, right? Denying it wouldn't solve the problem. And then they say, when things are open to public debate, you can easily get influenced by big company. No, I mean, this may happen centuries ago, but right now, social media, a lot of social media does exist, a lot of NGO does exist to provide alternate voices or alternate opinions to counteract this kind of system, right? To counteract this kind of company's oppression. So we believe that it wasn't much of a problem. The public will no longer be that susceptible to influence by big companies. And then they talk about the public may not be necessarily to comprehend with the long-term impact of law. We think this is good, right? We say that when public are given chance to strike down or to vote constitutions, the government have legitimate reason to suppress, to control the public, right? Because the government right now can say, well, you choose the law, you stay in here for a certain amount of year, then you can change it. Although you may suffer this kind of this amount of year, but this is what you choose. So we give the government legitimate reason to prevent that kind of conflict. Second thing is, it is also a good exercise for people to force people to vote properly and to debate properly, to think about what kind of policy this kind of policy will affect their life, right? And finally, right, society does change, and in the case which they do, this mechanism allows society to allow laws to catch up with the society quickly, right? Now, we believe that this quick mechanism is particularly important, right? Under the status quo, right now, law cannot catch up as quickly as possible. But under this mechanism, when societal value change, there's a timeline for you to strike down the law and review a new law that fits the public, right? This is particularly important because in order for a law to be enacted successfully, you need voluntary participation from the public, because in reality, there's never enough police to arrest everyone, right? So for a successful enactment of law, for a successful obedience of law from the public, you need public support. And this kind of mechanism provide a really quick way to garner public support for the particular policy, to prevent the erosion of policy, erosion of confidence on policy from happening. In the erosion of policy, we see instances like people burn down churches in Victoria, Australia, because the law no longer reflects public value. It's only appropriate, therefore, for us to catch up with the system, to catch up with the change of values quickly. And thus, we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, and to conclude the debate, I invite the opposition vote.
Noted change on constitutions can be made on the both sides of the House. The discussion is where we actually get a change, where we have a proper discussion about it, but that is less influenced by certain opinions, and where we can actually talk about those issues that we want to prioritize, rather than voting on a group of issues or not voting on some issues at all, right? So that is what the debate is really about. How we get best change that is best discussed and get it at a point where we actually need it. So the way I will structure my speech is first some responses to opening government and a comparison in the opening half in general, then moving on to closing government and to my partner's point. So opening government's case basically relies on the main premise that there is going to be a good discussion, right? A proper discussion. Note that there is 3 points that they bring that are all flawed. First of all, they assume that politicians necessarily want progress and that society is progressive, right? So the problem with that is that politicians aren't necessarily progressive, but they want to be re-elected. So the point where there is someone shaping public opinion because of their own interest, politicians aren't progressive anymore. Politicians do what their population wants, right? This public opinion can be easily influenced and very fastly be changed by lobbying, by how much money people put into it, but also like current events like bigger crisis or or something like that, where media narratives change very, very quickly, right? That means that we don't get all the good outcomes that opening governments wants to talk about at the point where, where society isn't as progressive as they necessarily tell us. They just assume that progressiveness comes about with time, right? No, the time sometimes lead towards outcomes, right? Then they assume that politicians would ask people for their opinions, right? No, the politicians don't just act based on people's opinions, but that they deliberately create and shape opinions, right? It is parties that actually have the money to shape opinions, right? That is what my partner told you, that it is those people that have money, right? Which is usually companies or parties shaping public opinions, winning referendums, right? Second of all, it is easy to flip laws where people don't actually understand them very well, right? When they don't know what exactly they're voting on, which is basically the problem in opening government maps. They've never explained whether we're going to vote on single issues or whether we're going to vote on a package of changes, right? In either case, basically, one option would be we're voting on all issues together. That just means that people don't look into all of those issues anymore, right? Or we're voting on single issues, which means nobody's actually bothered on voting on every of those single issues, and the whole system becomes very confusing. So, third point to make is greater political participation, right? They've never actually clearly explained how this is going to happen if that is only happening all 25 years, right? We're not going to prepare kids in school 25 years for that one single referendum, right? And they've also failed to explain why greater political participation is good at the point where we prove that society can vote very wrong. So moving on to closing, the main idea that we get from closing government is that it helps against bad governments, right? The problem with that, critics, the problem is that is directly clashing with opening government maps that basically have said this is going to be reviewed by politicians and courts that are probably related to the political government, right? That means politicians probably review it in their own interests, and courts probably going to review it based on what makes legally sense, not based on what is most important to the people of those countries, right? That means it doesn't necessarily help against bad politicians, right? They told you politicians want to be progressive. As I've told you again, politicians want to be re-elected, and my partner has told you how public opinions can be shaped. And their only response to this is, oh, there's Facebook, and there's counter opinions and those things like that. The problem with that is, like, companies can easily publish a nice video shaping people's opinion with some emotional music and publish it on Facebook. Companies can also buy clicks and attention on Facebook, making them seeming more important, which directly contributes to my partner's case that basically explains why all the harms that opening opposition talks about are actually going to happen, right? Then they talk about countries where there's less change, right? Because people are not actually reviewing it, which clashes with the point that my partner has brought to you about the kind of idea that people get, that if they've just voted on it, they're not going to change it again, right? And as I've told you, political opinions often change very much based on different years, right? So the constitution in Austria had to be reviewed in order to distribute refugees because of this crisis that appeared right now, right? At a point where the constitution has just been reviewed 5 years ago, people are actually less likely to take action and say, we have to change it right now. That means even though we might get some change on their side of the house, we don't get it at the moment where we actually need it, right? Opening.
Wait, look, in your world, the population is not aware on the urgency and importance of the change, so therefore they will not push for change. In our world, the huge social distance before such moments create the awareness.
Yes, please sit down. So, as closing has told you, there's still NGOs lobbying on something, right? The question is where they're actually more likely to push for change. The thing is, under your side of the house, you still haven't told me whether we're going to review a package or whether we're going to vote on single issues. In either case, it takes away bargaining power for those kind of groups that want to push for change, right? Because you cannot choose when to make this change, when it's actually most important. And also, those issues are going to be voted on together with a whole lot of other issues, right, that people probably want to get through, because this is like a really annoying process, having to review all the laws, as my partner has told you about the legal system, right? So reviewing all the constitution takes actually a lot of time, means that you have to adapt new laws, right? That means that those issues are very likely to actually get lost. While on the outside of the house, we prioritize those issues, those changes that people actually want to make, where they take the burden of putting an effort into having the constitution changed, even though it doesn't have to be changed. Very proud to oppose.